Great Plains, 1899. While his neighbors threw up standard plank shacks in 3 weeks, Lars Halvorsen was still building in late October. They called his setup a janitor's closet. They called him a fool for living underneath a water tower. He'd built a 10 by 10 room directly beneath 2,500 gallons of water, with double doors, thick walls, and a tiny cast iron stove. The local merchant laughed at the utility closet with a stove. Neighbors dismissed it as winter camping. One expert claimed all that stacked water would steal his heat. Then January arrived. The 1899 Arctic blast dropped temperatures into single digits for 10 straight days. Night lows hit 5 to 10 degrees below zero. Standard shacks recorded 30 to 35 degrees inside at dawn, ice forming in wash basins, families burning nearly a full cord of wood per month just to survive. But that morning, when Lars tapped his mercury thermometer at 4 a.m., it read 58 degrees inside while the air outside measured 12 below. His neighbors were freezing in their proper houses while the man in the water tower stayed warm with half the firewood. What did he understand about thermal mass, heat storage, and winter comfort that everyone else had missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The morning of October 15th, 1899, found Lars Halvorsen ankle-deep in sawdust, packing insulation between the inner and outer walls of what his neighbors had taken to calling the janitor's closet. At 42, the Norwegian immigrant had spent 3 months building what most homesteaders finished in 3 weeks, a structure that defied every convention of prairie construction. The foundation of his peculiar project sat beneath a windmill tower he'd assembled from salvaged parts and careful planning. The air motor pattern head, purchased used from a failing ranch 20 miles south, crowned 4 sturdy 6x6 posts at 12 feet on center in each direction. 2x6 knee braces locked the frame solid, creating a platform 18 feet above the brown autumn grass. Above that platform sat the reason for all the mockery, a redwood stave tank holding 2,500 gallons of water, roughly 20,850 pounds pressing down on the wooden structure. What made neighbors shake their heads wasn't the tower itself. Windmills dotted the landscape like mechanical flowers, each one a testament to the necessity of lifting water from deep wells. What they couldn't understand was why any sensible man would choose to live directly underneath all that weight, in a room barely large enough for a cot and a stove. Lars's living quarters measured exactly 10 feet by 10 feet, with wall studs of 2x4 lumber, spaced 16 inches on center. The exterior wore vertical 1x10 boards sealed with battens, a technique he'd learned watching his father repair fishing shacks along the Norwegian coast. Inside, he'd stretched scrim fabric over the studs and covered it with a lime clay plaster that dried to a smooth, pale finish. The ceiling stopped at 7 feet, deliberately short to reduce the volume of air his small stove would need to warm. The floor rode on 2x6 joists laid across 4x6 skids, raised just high enough to allow air circulation while perimeter skirtboards cut the worst of the wind that swept endlessly across the plains. His door system drew the most ridicule of all, 2 separate doors creating what he called a cold trap. The outer door, made of thick planks, opened to reveal a small vestibule barely 3 feet deep. Only after closing that first barrier could a visitor open the inner boarded door and enter the main room. Edwin Pike, who ran the settlement's dry goods store and considered himself an authority on practical construction, had made his opinion clear during his single visit in September. "That's not a house," he declared, standing in the cramped space and looking up at the low ceiling. "That's a utility closet with a stove. No man of standing would live in such a cramped arrangement." Pike favored the standard approach, single-wall construction with boards running horizontal, high ceilings for an airy feel, and a single door that opened directly into the main living space. Quick to build, cheap to maintain, and proper for a civilized man, he told anyone who'd listen. The civilized men Pike referenced had indeed built quickly. Most had thrown up structures using 1x12 boards nailed to simple frames, with gaps at the eaves and single doors that let in blasts of cold air every time they opened. Their rooms soared to 8 or 9 feet overhead, impressive to look at, but requiring enormous amounts of heated air to achieve any warmth. When winter winds found the gaps and cracks in their construction, the cold seemed to pour in like water through a sieve. Lars had different ideas about winter comfort, ideas shaped by memories of coastal storms and the tight, efficient rooms that had kept his family warm through North Sea gales. His cast iron box stove, barely large enough to hold 5 or 6 splits of wood, sat in the center of his compact room with 5 feet of stovepipe running up through a sheet metal heat shield he'd fabricated himself. Early tests suggested the little stove would consume perhaps 4/10 of a cord per month during the hardest cold, a fraction of what his neighbors would burn in their drafty, high-ceilinged spaces. But the feature that drew the most skepticism was the plumbing system that justified the entire arrangement. 3/4-inch iron pipe descended from the tank above, controlled by a brass stopcock that allowed him to draw water directly into a tin-lined sink, 24 inches wide. The pressure wasn't dramatic, roughly 7 3/10 pounds per square inch, created by 17 feet of elevation, but it was steady and reliable. A floor drain carried wastewater to a gravel dry well he dug 30 feet from the tower. The luxury of water on demand, drawn from a tap without pumping or hauling, represented a level of convenience that most frontier households could only dream of achieving. While his neighbors would spend 20 to 40 minutes twice daily hauling water from distant wells. Often breaking through ice during winter months, Lars could fill a kettle or wash basin in seconds without leaving his warm room. Yet convenience wasn't what Lars talked about when pressed to explain his unusual arrangement. Instead, he would mention almost casually that water held heat longer than wood or air, and that he planned to use it to take the sting out of night. Most listeners assumed he meant the warm water itself, drawn from a tank that sat in sunlight during the day. Few understood that he was thinking about thermal mass on a much larger scale, 2,500 gallons worth of heat storage suspended directly over his head. As October temperatures began their steady decline toward winter, neighbor wives would pause their washing to watch smoke rise from the short chimney of the closet. They'd shake their heads at the sight of a grown man choosing to live in such cramped quarters when he could have built a proper house with the same materials and effort. The consensus among the settlement's practical folks remained firm. Lars Halvorsen had built himself an elaborate camping arrangement that would prove its folly when real winter arrived. None of them had bothered to check a thermometer on a cold morning, or notice that the man living under all that water never seemed to hurry when winter winds began to blow. The January air mass that descended on the Great Plains in 1899 carried the breath of the Arctic, pushing temperatures into realms that tested every assumption about winter survival. On the morning of January 10th, mercury thermometers across the region registered readings that made even veteran frontiersmen pause, single digits before dawn, with daytime highs struggling to reach 25 degrees. Night after night, the cold deepened, settling into a pattern that would stretch for 10 brutal days. In the standard plank shacks scattered across the prairie, families huddled around drum stoves and sheet metal heaters, burning wood at rates that consumed their winter stores with alarming speed. Mercy Whitcomb, managing her household in a typical 1x12 board construction, found herself feeding splits into her stove every 2 hours through the night, yet still woke to ice forming in the wash basin she kept near the fire. Her single-door entry let in floods of frigid air each time she stepped outside for fuel, and the high ceiling of her main room seemed to swallow, heat like a hungry mouth. The Whitcomb shack, representative of dozens built using Edwin Pike's preferred methods, demonstrated the harsh mathematics of heating large volumes of air with inadequate insulation. At 4 a.m, with the fire banked low, her indoor thermometer read 31 degrees, a temperature that left frost on the inside of windows and made sleep a struggle against chattering teeth. By her careful accounting, she was burning through nearly a full cord of wood each month, at a pace that threatened to exhaust her winter supply before February ended. Similar scenes played out in neighboring structures. Canvas-lined huts registered even worse numbers, with interior temperatures dropping to 28 or 30 degrees during the coldest pre-dawn hours. Families took to sleeping in their clothes, piling every available blanket and coat onto beds that felt more like outdoor camping arrangements than indoor shelter. The constant battle against infiltration, cold air seeping through gaps in walls, around ill-fitted doors, and down from uninsulated ceiling spaces, consumed fuel and human energy in equal measure. 20 yards away, Lars Halvorsen was conducting a different kind of winter experiment. Each morning before dawn, he would rise from his narrow cot and tap the mercury thermometer hanging on his interior wall. The reading rarely disappointed him. On the same morning that Mercy's thermometer showed 31 degrees, his registered 53 degrees, a difference that represented the gap between misery and comfort, between survival and genuine warmth. The source of this remarkable performance lay in principles that most frontier builders had never considered. Above Lars's head, 2,500 gallons of water provided what engineers would later term thermal mass, a reservoir of stored heat that responded slowly to temperature changes. Unlike wood or air, which shed their warmth quickly when the fire died down, water possessed what scientists called specific heat capacity. Each pound of water required 1 British thermal unit to raise its temperature by 1 degree Fahrenheit. With over 20,000 pounds of water in his tank, even a modest 3-degree temperature swing represented more than 60,000 BTUs of stored energy. Lars didn't heat his water directly, nor did he need to. During daylight hours, pale winter sun and the gentle warmth from his stove nudged the tank temperature upward by a few degrees. At night, as outside temperatures plummeted, that stored heat bled back slowly through the tank's wooden staves and into the airspace around his room. The effect was subtle but profound. Instead of wild temperature swings that characterize thin-walled structures, his living space experienced gentle moderation that kept the worst of winter's bite at bay. The tight envelope he'd constructed amplified this thermal advantage. His board and batten exterior walls, sealed with lime clay plaster on the interior, cut air infiltration to a fraction of what plagued standard construction. The double-door system eliminated the cold flood that occurred when single doors opened directly into heated spaces. Most crucially, his 7-foot ceiling created a compact volume that his small stove could warm efficiently, while still allowing the thermal mass effect from above to moderate temperature swings. Even his water system contributed to the overall comfort. The gravity-fed plumbing delivered water that stayed above freezing thanks to the tank's thermal mass, allowing him to wash, cook, and clean with liquid water while his neighbors chipped ice from buckets and basins. The humidity from cooking and cleaning raised the perceived warmth of his interior air, making 50-degree temperatures feel as comfortable as 60 degrees in a dry environment. The contrast became most stark during the pre-dawn hours, when fires burned lowest and human bodies generated the least heat. While families in standard shacks woke to near-freezing conditions that required immediate fire building and vigorous movement to prevent hypothermia, Lars could rise leisurely in his 50-degree room, add a single split to his banked coals, and pour water for coffee without the desperate urgency that characterized his neighbors' morning routines. His fuel consumption told an equally compelling story. Where families like the Whitcombs burned 9/10 of a cord per month, Lars's careful record showed consumption of less than half that amount. His small stove, designed for the compact volume it needed to heat, achieved the same comfort levels while consuming roughly 4/10 of a cord monthly. The mathematics were undeniable. Better insulation, controlled air exchange, and thermal mass delivered superior performance at significantly lower cost. By the end of the first week of brutal cold, the settlement's residents had begun to notice the differences. Smoke from Lars's short chimney rose in steady, controlled volumes, never the desperate billowing clouds that marked households struggling to achieve warmth. More telling still, he could be seen moving calmly about his routine, while others hurried between buildings, hunched against the cold that seemed to penetrate every aspect of daily life. The numbers painted a clear picture of two different approaches to winter survival, one succeeding where the other struggled. Yet most neighbors still dismissed the tankhouse as an oddity, assuming that spring would reveal hidden problems with the unconventional arrangement. Few were prepared to acknowledge that the man they'd mocked might have understood something fundamental about heat, mass, and comfort that had escaped the collective wisdom of the frontier community. The cold that had settled over the plains in mid-January showed no signs of breaking as the calendar turned toward February. 2 additional northern fronts swept through during the 3rd and 4th weeks, each one driving temperatures deeper into the single digits and stretching fuel supplies across the settlement to their breaking points. What had begun as a 10-day ordeal extended into 6 weeks of the most sustained cold that veteran homesteaders could remember. In the scattered shacks and cabins, families had begun the grim mathematics of rationing. Wood piles that looked substantial in November now appeared frighteningly small against the relentless consumption required to maintain even marginal warmth. Men ventured out in temperatures that made metal tools dangerous to touch with bare skin, searching for deadfall timber or cutting green wood that burned poorly and produced less heat than seasoned fuel. Women calculated splits per day against days remaining until spring, often reaching conclusions that left no margin for error. The physical toll of winter survival had begun to show in hollow cheeks and the peculiar exhaustion that came from never being truly warm. Children developed persistent coughs from breathing air that rarely rose above 40 degrees inside their homes. Adults moved with the careful, deliberate motions of people conserving energy for essential tasks only. The daily routine of survival, hauling water from wells where pump cups froze solid, splitting wood with hands that lost feeling within minutes, maintaining fires that seemed to consume fuel without producing adequate warmth, left little time or strength for anything beyond basic existence. Lars Halvorsen had developed a different rhythm for winter living, one built around precision rather than desperation. His stove firing followed a schedule honed through careful observation and measurement. Each evening at sunset, he loaded 2 splits of seasoned piñon or juniper into his small cast iron box, adjusted the damper to 1/3 open, and cracked the ash door 1/8 of an inch for exactly 20 minutes before closing it completely. This controlled burn brought his flue temperature to between 325 and 450 degrees Fahrenheit, as measured by a tin thermometer he'd positioned at the stovepipe elbow. The midnight check required only a single split, added to coals that remained viable from the evening charge. At 5 in the morning, he kindled the fire again using slab scraps saved from his construction work, thin pieces that caught quickly and brought the room to comfortable temperature within minutes. This methodical approach to fuel management meant his small stove never worked harder than necessary, never wasted heat up an overheated chimney, and never left him scrambling for emergency warmth during the coldest pre-dawn hours. His compact room allowed for modifications that would have been impossible in larger spaces. He installed a felt door sweep that sealed the gap beneath his inner door, eliminating one of the primary sources of cold air infiltration. At night, he plugged his small window with cloth soaked in flour paste, creating an airtight seal that reduced infiltration by an estimated 20 to 30% based on smoke stick tests he conducted on calm days. He checked the chinking at his baseboards weekly, pressing clay and oakum into any gaps that opened as the lumber contracted in the extreme cold. The thermal mass effect from his water tank had proven even more beneficial than he'd anticipated. Rather than installing risky direct heating coils that could create dangerous pressure or scalding temperatures, he'd fabricated a simple galvanized shroud around a section of his stovepipe. This passive heat exchanger warmed the air beneath the tank floor without directly heating the water, maintaining the tank's bottom boards at 38 to 42 degrees even during the coldest nights. The result was a gentle warming effect that moderated the most extreme temperature swings without requiring additional fuel or complex mechanical systems. His gravity water system transformed daily routines that had become ordeals for his neighbors. While families struggled with frozen pump mechanisms and the dangerous work of hauling water across icy ground, Lars drew 2 to 3 gallons per minute directly at his sink whenever needed. The water, warmed by the tank's thermal mass, allowed him hot wash-ups twice daily, a luxury that helped prevent the skin ailments and general decline that often accompanied frontier winters. He kept an enamel pot of broth at 160 degrees on his stovetop, providing both humidity and ready nutrition that supported his health while neighbors shared single kettles among multiple families. The contrast in daily life became most apparent during the work routines that winter imposed. His neighbors spent 6 to 10 trips daily hauling water from distant wells, each journey requiring 20 to 40 minutes of exposure to dangerous cold and treacherous footing. Lars made 0 water trips, spending those saved hours on productive indoor work, tool maintenance, gear repair, and planning for spring activities. The elimination of water hauling alone saved him between 2 and 4 hours of dangerous outdoor work each day. His fuel consumption records, maintained with the methodical precision of a man who understood that numbers didn't lie, showed remarkable efficiency gains. Over the 6-week cold period, he burned approximately 45 hundredths of a cord, while his neighbors averaged 9/10ths of a cord for the same period, a fuel savings of 50% achieved while maintaining superior comfort levels. His pre-dawn indoor temperatures held steady between 48 and 52 degrees, while neighboring structures recorded readings between 30 and 35 degrees. The settlement's blacksmith, Enoch Graves, had begun paying attention to these differences with the professional interest of a man who understood heat, metal, and the behavior of materials under stress. His Civil War service had taught him to recognize effective versus wasteful approaches to keeping men warm and equipment functional. During his occasional visits to trade metalwork for carpentry services, he'd begun taking note of flue temperatures, draft patterns, and the general condition of Lars's heating system. His shop notes recorded details about sheet metal stove guards, tight elbow joints, and the double-door vestibule that could be replicated with materials available at any frontier settlement. As February approached and fuel piles throughout the settlement dwindled to alarming levels, the mathematical advantages of the tankhouse system had become impossible to ignore. While families rationed splits and debated whether to burn furniture or risk exposure, the man living under 2,500 gallons of water maintained his steady routine, his comfort, and his fuel reserves. The approaching crisis would soon force even the most skeptical neighbors to acknowledge that unconventional methods sometimes delivered conventional results, survival, comfort, and the preservation of resources that meant the difference between making it through winter and facing genuine danger. The crisis that transformed skepticism into desperate inquiry came on the night of February 3rd, when Mercy Whitcomb's 6-month-old son developed a cough that rattled through the 30-degree air of their plank shack like a death sentence. The infant's breathing grew labored as ice crystals formed on the inside walls of their single-room home, and no amount of stoking the drum stove could raise the interior temperature above the mid-30s. By dawn, with the outside thermometer reading 12 degrees below zero and a fierce wind driving the cold through every gap in their construction, Mercy made a decision that would have been unthinkable 2 months earlier. She wrapped her child in every available blanket, gathered her husband William, and walked across the frozen ground to Lars Halverson's peculiar dwelling. The request she made standing in the bitter wind outside his double-door entry marked the first time anyone in the settlement had asked to shelter inside what they'd mockingly called the janitor's closet. Lars opened both doors without hesitation, and the family stepped into an environment that felt like entering a different season altogether. The contrast struck them immediately and measurably. While their own thermometer had read 33 degrees at 4 in the morning after a night of constant fire tending, Lars's mercury gauge showed 58 degrees at the same hour following only a 10:30 evening stoke. The infant's labored breathing eased within minutes of entering the warm, humid air that Lars's cooking and washing had created through the steady availability of liquid water. Mercy found herself removing layers of clothing for the first time in weeks, her body responding to genuine warmth rather than the desperate heat-seeking that characterized life in inadequately heated spaces. William Whitcomb, a practical man with experience in construction and skeptical of anything that seemed too good to be true, began his own investigation of the space that had sheltered them so effectively. He held a candle near the baseboards and watched its flame remain steady, contrasting sharply with the sideways flicker he was accustomed to seeing in his own drafty structure. The window glass in Lars's room showed only a light film of moisture, nothing approaching the quarter-inch frost that regularly coated the windows of standard construction throughout the settlement. The demonstration that convinced William came from watching Lars operate his water system. While pump cups throughout the settlement had frozen solid, requiring dangerous work with heated metal to restore function, Lars simply opened his brass stopcock and drew 2 to 3 gallons per minute in steady bursts. The water emerged above freezing temperature, warmed by its passage through the tank that had absorbed and held heat from the previous day's mild sun and evening fire. Mercy was able to wash her child with warm water, sterilize cloths, and prepare hot food using resources that seemed impossibly abundant compared to the rationed, ice-melting procedures that winter had imposed on every other household. Word of the infant's recovery and the family's comfortable night spread through the settlement with the speed that news travels in isolated communities facing shared hardship. By the second evening, Enoch Graves appeared at Lars's door carrying a bedroll and asking permission to spend the night. His blacksmith's understanding of heat transfer had prepared him to appreciate what he found, but the reality exceeded his expectations. The steady, even warmth that pervaded the compact space represented a level of comfort he hadn't experienced since leaving heated buildings in more established communities. Graves conducted his own measurements and observations with the methodical approach of a tradesman evaluating unfamiliar techniques. He noted the absence of the temperature stratification that plagued larger rooms where heat concentrated near the ceiling while floor-level air remained brutally cold. The thermal mass effect created remarkably even temperatures from floor to ceiling, eliminating the drafts and cold spots that made sleep difficult in conventional structures. His practiced eye took in details of construction, the tight ceiling joints, the effective door seals, the strategic positioning of the stove for maximum heat distribution. On the third night, 2 more neighbors arrived seeking shelter, followed by a fourth on the weekend. Each visitor brought their own preconceptions about the limitations of the cramped space and left with a new understanding of the relationship between volume, insulation, and heating efficiency. The mockery that had characterized earlier discussions of the tankhouse gave way to quiet conversations about construction techniques, material costs, and the practical steps required to achieve similar results. The turning point in community perception came when Edwin Pike himself, the dry goods merchant who had been the most vocal critic of Lars's unconventional approach, requested a tour of the facility during a particularly brutal February morning. Pike's merchant instincts had been sharpened by watching families ration purchases and delay payments as their fuel costs mounted beyond sustainable levels. The possibility that a different construction approach could reduce heating requirements by half represented a business opportunity as much as a technical curiosity. Pike's inspection revealed details that his earlier dismissive visit had missed. The board and batten construction with interior lime clay plaster created a thermal envelope significantly superior to the single-wall methods he'd been recommending. The double-door system eliminated the heat loss that occurred every time conventional doors opened directly into heated spaces. Most importantly, the integration with the water storage system provided benefits that extended far beyond the thermal mass effect: reliable water supply, reduced labor, and the comfort improvements that came from adequate humidity and the ability to maintain cleanliness even during the harshest weather. By month's end, former skeptics had begun implementing modified versions of Lars's techniques in their own structures. 3 families added vestibule entries to their existing doors, framing lean-to additions measuring 3 feet by 5 feet that could be built in 6 hours using $2.40 worth of boards and nails at store prices. Others focused on reducing infiltration through improved chinking, tighter ceiling joints, and temporary measures like cloth and paste window plugs during the coldest nights. The most ambitious adopters began planning complete tankhouse construction for the following year. Enoch Graves started fabricating hardware for double-door systems and improved stove installations, while families with existing windmill towers calculated the costs and benefits of enclosing the space beneath their water storage. The mathematical advantages, fuel savings of 40 to 60%, interior temperatures 20 to 30 degrees above ambient, and elimination of water hauling labor had created converts among people who measured success in degrees of warmth and cords of wood rather than architectural theory or social convention. Spring arrived in March with the gradual warming that allowed the settlement's residents to assess what they had learned during the harshest winter in memory. As temperatures climbed above freezing and fuel consumption dropped to manageable levels, families began planning modifications that would ensure they never again faced the desperate rationing and bone-deep cold that had characterized the previous months. The techniques that had kept Lars Halvorsen comfortable while his neighbors suffered had moved from curiosity to necessity in the minds of practical people who measured success in survival rather than convention. The Whitcomb family, whose infant's recovery had marked the first crack in community skepticism, became the earliest adopters of comprehensive tankhouse principles. William had spent his evenings during the coldest weeks sketching details of Lars's construction and calculating material requirements for their own enclosed tower room. By April, he had begun framing a 10 by 12 structure beneath their existing windmill platform, using many of the techniques he'd observed, but scaling them to accommodate his family's needs. His construction followed the proven pattern, with modifications learned through observation and consultation. Wall studs of 2 by 4 lumber at 16-inch centers, sheathed with 1 by 10 boards and battens, but with interior lime clay plaster applied over scrim fabric to create the tight thermal envelope that made efficient heating possible. The ceiling stopped at 7 feet to minimize volume, and the double-door system incorporated lessons learned from watching how the Halverson vestibule eliminated cold drafts during entry and exit. The O'Rourke brothers, Irish-American cattlemen whose reputation for quick construction had initially made them skeptical of Lars's methodical approach, undertook the most ambitious adaptation. Their operation required housing for multiple workers during winter months, and the fuel costs associated with heating several standard structures had consumed profits that should have supported expansion and improvement. Rather than build additional conventional bunkhouses, they designed a 12 by 12 tank house with a 3,000-gallon redwood tank, creating a communal heated space that could shelter 6 men while consuming less fuel than 2 separate shacks. Their construction incorporated refinements based on a full winter of observing the original tank house performance. The stove system used a larger cast iron box with improved draft controls and a more sophisticated heat shield arrangement developed by Enoch Graves in his blacksmith shop. The plumbing included a simple washing facility with multiple spigots, allowing the crew to maintain cleanliness and health during winter confinement. Most importantly, they added a small stock tank heater coil that could warm water for livestock without compromising the thermal mass effect that moderated interior temperatures. Enoch Graves documented the construction process and performance results with the precision of a tradesman who understood the value of reproducible techniques. His shop records showed material costs ranging from $18 to $27 for tower boards, nails, and door hardware, with used windmill heads available for $35 to $60 depending on condition. A new redwood tank, purchased through railroad freight, cost between $45 and $70, though several families opted to construct their own using local lumber and traditional coopering techniques. The performance results validated the investment in every measurable way. The O'Rourke tank house, operational by the following winter, maintained interior temperatures of 45 to 55 degrees during lows of 10 to 20 degrees below zero, while consuming approximately half the fuel required by conventional structures of similar size. Pre-dawn comfort levels eliminated the desperate morning fire-building routines that had characterized previous winters, allowing men to begin work productively rather than spending the first hours of daylight merely achieving survivable temperatures. Thomas Reed, the county surveyor whose circuit included documentation of wells, windmills, and agricultural improvements, began photographing and cataloging the tank house adaptations that appeared throughout his territory. His official records, maintained for road and tax assessment purposes, provided the documentary evidence that would later allow historians to trace the spread of the technique across the region. Reed's photographs showed the evolution from Lars's original 10 by 10 room to larger family structures and multi-person facilities that maintained the essential principles while adapting to different needs. The technique's adoption followed practical rather than theoretical lines. Families with existing windmill towers found the modification relatively straightforward, requiring primarily the addition of walls and thermal improvements to spaces they were already committed to maintaining. New construction increasingly incorporated tank house principles from the beginning, with water storage positioned to provide thermal mass benefits rather than simply elevated storage. The integration of heating, water supply, and thermal moderation in a single system appealed to settlers who valued efficiency and self-sufficiency over architectural convention. By the end of the second year following the hard winter, 4 neighboring operations had implemented some version of tank house construction, while others had adopted specific elements like double-door systems, improved chinking techniques, and strategic thermal mass placement. The fuel savings documented across these installations ranged from 40 to 60% compared to conventional construction, while comfort levels improved dramatically during the coldest periods when heating efficiency mattered most. The broader implications extended beyond individual comfort to community resilience. Families who could maintain warmth with half the fuel consumption were less vulnerable to supply disruptions, extreme weather events, and the economic pressures that could force abandonment of marginal homesteads. The reliable water supply eliminated one of the most dangerous and labor-intensive winter chores, while the improved indoor air quality reduced the respiratory ailments that often proved fatal during prolonged cold periods. County survey records from the 19 teens and 20s documented the continued presence of tankhouse construction throughout the region, with museum notes from later decades classifying such structures as a recognized vernacular building type common throughout California and the interior West between 1850 and 1930. The technique had evolved from one man's unconventional solution to an established pattern that builders could adapt to local conditions and requirements. On the frontier, comfort and sometimes survival belonged to those who learned to work with natural forces rather than against them, and a room beneath a few tons of water wasted far less heat than the proudest, emptiest roof that failed to moderate the night's killing cold.